You might not follow G7 politics, but if you're a hog farmer in the US, a decision made at the Canadian border this past March may have just changed your entire livelihood. Canada said no to American pork, and in just a matter of days, everything was thrown off balance. Export permits cancelled, pork prices plunged by more than 50%, and the entire supply chain from slaughterhouses to family-run farms was thrown into chaos. Thousands of market-ready pigs left with nowhere to go, and the farmers, they stood in their barns watching the animals grow with no one to sell them to. One decision made in Ottawa, but its impact hit straight at the heart of American agriculture. This isn't just a temporary export hiccup, it's a warning bell proof that a single crack in the global trade system can rip right through the foundation of domestic livestock farming. And what follows are 10 states now bearing the brunt of that crack first. North Carolina. In North Carolina, hog farming isn't just an industry, it's an ecosystem. Over 2,100 farms, tens of thousands of workers, and one critical facility, Smithfield Foods. Tar Heel plant formed the heart of an entire supply chain, but not long ago that heart skipped a beat when Canada announced it would halt pork imports from the Tar Heel plant over an issue related to organ processing. No one expected the fallout to be this severe. Within days, Canadian partners cancelled orders. Thousands of pigs ready for market were suddenly stuck in limbo, and keeping them wasn't a solution because pigs keep growing, and every extra day of feed chips away at farmers' already thin margins. According to the North Carolina Pork Council, within just 2 weeks of the export suspension, farms in Dupin-Sampson and Bladen counties were holding nearly 40,000 pigs past their Selby date. Not by choice, but because there was nowhere left to send them. Domestic slaughterhouses were at capacity, and in-state retailers simply couldn't absorb that volume. Tar Heel, the largest pork processing plant in the US, only needed one closed door to throw the entire system out of rhythm. Workers at the plant saw their hours cut, shipping routes from North Carolina to the Northeast paused overnight. One Fayetteville-based trucking company reported losing 4 major contracts in just 10 days. And the irony: farmers did nothing wrong. They don't run the slaughterous, they don't control international food safety standards, but they're the first to suffer because their pigs go unsold. And the loans they took out 6 months ago to raise them now hang over their heads with no way to pay them back. This disruption in North Carolina isn't just a local mishap, it's a clear warning about how fragile America's livestock system really is, where a single weak link, whether at a border crossing or inside a factory, can turn months of labor into dead weight. And while eastern farmers grapple with surplus hogs and missed payments deep in the heart of the Midwest, once proud home to America's grain and pork belt, a different kind of shockwave is beginning to hit, one that cuts even deeper. Iowa. Nowhere in America produces more pork than Iowa. Nearly 30 million hogs raised each year, over 50 million tons of corn turned into feed. Thousands of families whose entire lives revolve around one chain: raising, processing, exporting. But in early 2025, those numbers stopped being a source of pride. They became a burden. Canada's temporary suspension of imports from a major North Carolina plant may have seemed like someone else's problem, but for Iowa, it sparked a silent storm, because Canada wasn't just buying pork from one plant, it was buying from the entire system behind it. And Iowa, home to the largest live hog transit network in the country, was suddenly at the center of it all, as contracts to ship live hogs across the border were frozen. Farms in Hardin, Franklin, and Hamilton counties were forced to hold far more animals than they could handle. Slaughterhouses in Sioux City and Ottawa, already operating at full capacity, simply couldn't take any more. The Iowa Department of Agriculture reported that within just 3 weeks of the disruption, hog inventory ballooned by over 14%, while farm gate prices plunged to their lowest point since 2019. This wasn't just a crisis for farmers, the ripple effects hit everyone: feed suppliers, vet services, logistics companies. One livestock hauler out of Des Moines revealed that more shipments were cancelled in March alone than the entire previous quarter combined. Meanwhile, rural banks began tightening credit lines for small and mid-sized hog operations, many of which are already drowning in debt. Iowa wasn't under any formal trade ban, but when a single link in the chain is severed, the whole system buckles, and that's the harsh reality. Even a minor disruption in international trade can choke the heartland, where production is massive but entirely dependent on crossbar flows. They can't control no violence, no headlines. But in Iowa's eerily quiet barns, there's one thing rising by the day. Worry Minnesota in Minnesota folks don't talk much about politics, but they understand supply chains, especially when those very chains are what keep thousands of family farms alive. So when Canada temporarily shut its doors to a chunk of US pork, the impact didn't stop at the border. It echoed straight into the Quiet Valley's barns and towns of this state, with over 3,500 hog farms. Minnesota ranks among the top 5 pork-producing states in America, but unlike Iowa, where slaughterhouses dominate, Minnesota plays a different role. It's the backbone of coordination, genetics, feed, breeding, stock, interstate transport. It all moves through here. That's why when Canadian contracts froze in early March, Minnesota's logistical network started to wobble. Shipping companies in Mano and Rochester reported cancellation rates more than doubling. Some feed suppliers were forced to halt backup deliveries because hogs were being held on farms far beyond their scheduled dates, driving feed costs up and draining credit reserves. According to the Minnesota Pork Board, over 22,000 hogs missed their scheduled transfer from farms to processing facilities in March alone due to bottlenecks in capacity and cancelled northern contracts. Even mid-size plants in places like Worthington began trimming weekend shifts and letting workers go, something unheard of during the early year export rush. But the real crisis isn't just about backlog, it's the paralysis. The whole state was thrown into a holding pattern, waiting on trade updates, waiting on prices to bounce back, waiting for cancelled contracts to come back online. But farming doesn't wait. Hogs keep growing, interest keeps compounding, and producers are left standing in barns crunching numbers like gamblers, playing their final hand. Minnesota didn't have a plant shut down yet. It suffered just as if someone pulled the plug. When Canada said pause, Motons knew it wasn't just politics. It was a wake-up call that the survival of America's agriculture is now decided in meeting rooms thousands of miles away, and while the chill of uncertainty still lingers over Minnesota's thawing fields. Farther south, another state where small hog farms once formed the backbone of entire communities is beginning to crack under a pressure with no exit in sight. Nebraska. There was a time when Nebraska shipped live hogs and frozen pork across the Canadian border every week, like clockwork. But after the suspension order hit in early March, everything ground to a halt. Farms across Lancaster, Dodge and Seward were suddenly stuck holding back tens of thousands of fully grown pigs, with nowhere to send them. A report from the Nebraska Pork Producers Association showed that within just 2 weeks, backlog numbers jumped by 18% and pin prices dropped to their lowest. In years, the machines kept running, the feeders stayed on, but when the buyers disappeared, the whole supply chain became a pane of glass cracking under the weight of an increasingly fragile market. Slaughterhouses in Omaha and Grand Island were forced to cut shifts and lay off workers. Hog transport trucks turned around at the northern border. Feed piled up in storage. Meanwhile, farms still had to pay the power bills, keep the crews on payroll and cover rising care costs for animals that should have been long gone. What made it worse in Nebraska was the cruel math. The hogs kept growing, but prices didn't. The value of a pork shank at border markets didn't drop as fast as the cost of keeping the whole animal alive. Farmers were left holding on to both the pigs and the dead, and as bank loan deadlines approached, the spectre of bankruptcy got a little closer. When the largest farms in the state, once proud symbols of stability and progress, begin posting for sale signs or quietly shift into cattle operations. The message is clear: Nebraska isn't being brought down by bullets or bans, it's being undone by the cold silence of a stalled market. And if in Nebraska, where pigs still grow strong and fields stretch to the horizon, the sound of hunger is already fading, then what's happening just downstream in a state whose entire economy once depended on trucks rumbling north toward Canada is even more urgent and even more devastating: Ohio. Once a critical link in the agricultural logistics network of the Midwest Ohio, has now become a land of turned-back trucks, overstayed warehouses, and anxious eyes cast toward the northern border. Canada's decision to suspend pork imports from major U.S. facilities didn't strike Ohio directly, but it's choking off the state's role as the quiet backbone of the agricultural value chain. Tens of thousands of hogs from neighboring states have flooded into Ohio, waiting for processing, redistribution, or cross-spur transit, but with border doors slammed shut and export orders in limbo. Ohio isn't a hub anymore. It's a bottleneck. Within 3 weeks, processing facilities in the western part of the state were forced to cut capacity by 40%. Plants in cities like Lima and Fremont have begun rotating layoffs because they simply can't run at full speed when the product has nowhere to go for transporters. It's a different kind of pain. The work doesn't stop, but the trucks are running empty. Refrigerated trailers that once moved pork across the border into Ontario now sit idle in container lots or limp around, making small deliveries within the state, where consumer demand has dried up, battered by inflation and shrinking household budgets. The cold chain, once a crown jewel of the meat export economy, has become a money pit, burning fuel and resources by the hour. And perhaps the most alarming shift is hitting at the roots, not in the mega farms, but in the family-run operations that once thrived by supplying piglets and feeder hogs to larger cooperatives. Now those contracts are gone, prices for young stock have tanked, and the feed bills keep climbing. Some are forced into fire sales, others are quietly weighing decisions they never thought they'd face about thinning their herds in ways no one wants to speak aloud. Ohio is becoming a textbook case of silent collapse, not caused by a direct embargo or a natural disaster, but by a chain that's slowly coming undone link by link, until it no longer holds the interstate and international flows of commerce once seen as a strength, now expose a fragile underbelly, especially when no one knows if Canada will reopen its market tomorrow or tighten the screws further. And if even Ohio, an inland state, not even on the front lines, can start to tremble from the shockwaves of a border disruption, then the next state down the line, once hailed as the engine of livestock, industrialization in America's heartland, may be in for something even harder to withstand. Illinois was once the pivot point of northern agriculture, a powerhouse where pork wasn't just raised, but processed, packaged, and shipped out across the globe as a symbol of America's domestic strength. With an intricate web of rail lines, processing hubs and trade routes reaching all the way to the Great Lakes, Illinois stood tall as a gateway to international markets. But when Canada slammed the door shut on key American pork producers, the blow didn't have to land directly. It still rattled Illinois to its core in less than a month. Processing facilities around Joliet, Rockford, and Springfield reported a 25% drop in orders. Not because of a supply shortage. Hogs from Iowa and Missouri were still arriving steadily, but because the exit routes had vanished. Rail shipments bound for Ontario were postponed indefinitely. Northern-bound logistics operations were temporarily suspended, and the cold storage containers stacked in southern Chicago, once stamped ready for export, now sit idle layer upon layer with nowhere to go. Farmers in Illinois don't just raise pigs. They've invested heavily in high-tech barns, climate-controlled systems, and precision feeding, all to meet the demands of international buyers. But when exports grind to a halt, those investments turn into burdens. Monthly payments on cold housing systems, interest on automation loans, payroll for environmental techs every day becomes a loss, and no one knows when the bleeding will stop. In rural corners of the state, unemployment is quietly rising, seasonal. Workers once kept on year-round, thanks to steady production, are now let go weeks, sometimes months ahead of schedule. Supporting industries from feed equipment suppliers to packaging manufacturers are seeing orders dry up. Small pieces start to fall away, and the entire picture begins to crumble quietly, but consistently. Illinois isn't a state that folds easily, but when the export engine stalls, the state's entire agri-industrial complex begins to groan like an old machine, long overdue for maintenance. And if a region this strong, this prepared, can be dragged into the undertow of economic slowdown, then the next place on the map home to smaller farms, but equally dependent on trade, may find itself slipping even faster down the slope. Indiana was never home to mega farms with hundreds of thousands of hogs, but what it excelled at, was a tightly woven network of mid-sized family farms and co-ops that built a resilient local agricultural economy over generations. That resilience, however, came with a condition: cash had to flow fast and steady. Hogs went out. Money came in, enough to buy feed, pay workers, and keep the cycle alive. But when Canada abruptly pulled out of the pork trade, that cycle began to grind and groan like a wheel, losing momentum across counties. Like Jasper, Wabash, and Miami, farmers are witnessing something they've never seen before: hogs ready for market, sitting idle in pens for weeks. Not because of truck shortages, but because there's nowhere left to send them. Some co-ops were forced into a painful choice: sell at a loss to an already saturated in-state market, or hold the animals longer, racking up feed costs and risking health issues in the process for Indiana's farmers. This isn't just about losing a market, it's about losing faith in the very system they've relied on to survive. They don't have massive reserve funds, they're not protected by comprehensive insurance. Like the big corporate players, when contracts evaporate, there's no compensation, just a brief notice. Our northern partner has suspended imports, and making things worse, the cost of transportation has skyrocketed. Trucks that once hauled hogs to the Canadian border and returned with packaged goods for the eastern states are now driving back empty. That one-way burden has doubled freight rates, forcing many co-ops to cancel long-haul shipments altogether. They're turning inward, trying to offload to the local market, where consumer demand is already tapped out. Indiana used to take pride in having one of the highest feed-to-product conversion rates in the Midwest. But these days, that statistic means nothing when the end product doesn't move. No amount of efficiency can save. The farm and as producers struggle to hang on, feed suppliers and equipment dealers have started pulling the plug on credit. They're not sure they'll get paid either. What was once a small, self-sustaining agricultural ecosystem is quietly fracturing piece by piece, like a puzzle with its critical parts slowly pulled away. And if Indiana, once held up as a model for balanced cooperative farming, can get swept into this downward spiral, then what's coming next for a state where industrial-scale livestock was supposed to be the backbone of the economy? Missouri. You don't need a spreadsheet to understand what's happening in Missouri. Just stand on the edge of a livestock auction in the Ozarks. The crowd is there, but the hands aren't going up. The opening bid for a batch of feeder pigs is lower than what it costs to raise them. No bargaining, no competition. The air feels less like a market and more like a quiet funeral one, where no one wants to say goodbye. Missouri isn't collapsing in a blaze, it's fading in silence as small livestock farmers, once firm believers in a proud tradition, begin shutting their barns for good. From the western plains to the southern hills, fields that once roared with truck engines now echo only with the sound of wind brushing against rusted tin roofs. Breeding stations that used to bustle are now open just 2 days a week and often sit empty. Everyone knows Canada stopped buying. That's not the shock. What cuts deeper in Missouri is the lack of explanation. No timeline for recovery, no guidance, no words of assurance to help farmers hold on. Most here have weathered price swings before, but no one was ready for this kind of cold, clean break. It hit like a phone call in the dead of night. It's over. We don't need it anymore. Small processors once supplying pork to Manitoba and Ontario have scaled down or shuttered entirely. cold chain operators, packaging companies, and specialized feed suppliers are watching their revenues plummet. But it's the farmers who are bearing the worst of it, staring into empty barns, asking themselves whether to start over or to finally let go of the dream that's been passed down through. 3 generations. A man in his 60s near Sadalia told a local paper he wasn't sad about losing a contract. What crushed him was that for the first time in 40 years, he had no idea what he'd raise next season. That sense of being quietly abandoned, with no warning, no closure, is what makes Missouri so fragile. Now there's no path forward and no promises left to follow. And if Missouri, a place where community farming still carried soul, where raising hogs was once a way of life, can be brought to its knees by a trade disruption with no notice and no plan,